It was the spring of 2015 when Ethan Carter returned to the small town of Bellwood, Kentucky, his hometown, nestled in the hills where the air smelled of pine and earth. A place that seemed unchanging, untouched by the world beyond. Here, everyone knew everyone, and secrets, if they existed, were buried deep. But in a town like Bellwood, secrets never stayed hidden for long. Ethan's return wasn't a choice, it was the result of a crushing wave of guilt that had driven him back. His mother had passed when he was only 3, leaving a void in his life that nothing had ever quite filled. His father, David Carter, was a quiet man, a man who spoke little but worked tirelessly, and in the years following his mother's death, he'd become a shadow of himself, aloof and distant. Ethan had spent much of his childhood seeking solace in the comforting, maternal presence of Claire Matthews, the wife of Pastor William Matthews. Claire had become a surrogate mother, her kind smile a balm to his aching heart. Ethan often found himself drawn to her house, a place where he could feel cared for, where the scent of freshly baked bread and the soft hum of hymns seemed to erase the loneliness that clung to him. Claire had been the one who taught him to pray before bed, who comforted him when he was scared, and who held him when the world felt too harsh. To Ethan, she wasn't just the pastor's wife, she was a mother, a lifeline. But as the years passed, something began to shift. Ethan had always seen Claire as a maternal figure, someone who had been there for him in ways his own mother never could. But the spring of 2014 marked a turning point. Ethan was 19 now, no longer the innocent child who had run around the churchyard with wooden toys carved by Pastor William. Now, he was a young man, his once boyish features maturing into the lean, confident face of a man discovering his own desires. One warm evening, as the sun began to dip behind the hills and the air hung heavy with the scent of jasmine, Ethan arrived at Claire's house after church, just as he had so many times before. This time, however, things felt different. The usual sense of calm was replaced by an undercurrent of tension. Claire greeted him at the door, her smile as warm as ever, but her eyes, dark and searching, held a glimmer of something more. She was dressed casually, yet the tight-fitting blouse and the way her hair fell around her shoulders caught his attention in a way he hadn't noticed before. They went about their usual tasks, Claire in the kitchen, Ethan offering to help with the garden, but as the evening wore on, the air between them grew thick with unspoken words. Ethan's heart began to race as he noticed the way Claire's movements seemed slower, more deliberate. The way her voice, soft and gentle, held an undertone of something he couldn't name. And then there was the way she looked at him, her gaze lingering just a moment too long, her lips curving into a smile that was warmer, more intimate than anything he'd ever seen from her before. As Ethan moved toward the kitchen to fetch a drink, his mind whirled. He had never thought of Claire in this way before, she had always been a mother to him. But tonight, everything was changing. He tried to push the thoughts aside, but the flutter in his chest wouldn't go away. He couldn't stop looking at her. There was something about her, the way she moved, the way she spoke, that stirred something deep inside him. Something forbidden. Something that made his pulse quicken. Claire, too, felt it. Though her exterior remained calm and composed, inside, her emotions were tangled. She had spent years in a marriage where the passion had long since faded, where her husband's devotion to the church had left her lonely and yearning. As she watched Ethan, her heart beat faster. She saw him now not as the boy she had cared for, but as a man, strong, handsome, and full of vitality. For the first time in years, she felt desired. As Ethan left the house that evening, his mind was filled with confusion and shame. What had happened to their relationship? How had it shifted so suddenly? For Claire, it was only the beginning. The seeds of something dangerous had been planted. The storm was coming, and neither of them could see it. The months that followed that unsettling evening at Claire Matthews' house seemed to pass in a haze. Ethan couldn't escape the memory of the way her eyes lingered on him, the way her voice had sounded just a little too soft, the way the air had thickened between them. Every time he returned to her house, the tension was palpable, hanging like a thick fog in the room. He tried to push it down, to tell himself that Claire was just being kind, that it was all in his head. But deep down, he knew something had changed, something irreversible. Claire, too, was struggling with her emotions. In the quiet moments when she was alone, the memory of Ethan's gaze, the way he looked at her with an intensity she hadn't seen before, haunted her. She had always known that Ethan saw her as a mother figure, someone who had cared for him when he had nothing else. But now, there was something more in his eyes, a flicker of desire that sent shivers through her. She wasn't sure if she was imagining it, but the thought of it made her heart race. Her marriage to William had long been strained. Over the years, his devotion to the church had only deepened, leaving Claire to navigate the quiet emptiness of their home. They had become more like strangers than lovers, their interactions cold and distant. There were no late-night conversations, no tender touches, no passionate embraces. Just the constant hum of church duties and the isolation of being married to a man who was more in love with his congregation than with her. But with Ethan, everything was different. She could see the admiration in his eyes, the way he hung on every word she spoke. She could feel his longing, his need for connection, just as she had once felt it herself. Claire had always prided herself on being a strong woman, a mother to many, but deep down, she yearned for something more. Ethan's presence stirred something in her that she had buried for years. She had long forgotten what it felt like to be wanted, to be seen as something more than just a wife or a mother. Ethan, however, saw her, not just as a caretaker, but as a woman. Every time they shared a quiet moment together, whether it was over tea in the kitchen or sitting side by side on the porch, Claire felt a rush of emotions that confused and frightened her. She knew the lines between them were becoming dangerously blurred. Yet, she couldn't stop herself. She was drawn to him, like a moth to a flame. The affection she had for him, built over years of caring for him as a child, had blossomed into something darker, something forbidden. One evening, when William was away on a church retreat, Claire invited Ethan to stay for dinner. It was a gesture that had become routine over the years, but this time felt different. Ethan, hesitant at first, agreed. He arrived at her house to find Claire preparing a simple meal. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the trees outside. Ethan's stomach churned as he stepped inside, the familiar warmth of Claire's home suddenly feeling suffocating. They sat down at the table, the candlelight casting soft shadows on their faces. The conversation flowed easily at first, talking about mundane things, the weather, the town's upcoming festival, the people in the congregation. But the tension between them simmered just below the surface, making the air thick and heavy. As Claire spoke, her voice was low and soothing, but there was an underlying intensity to it. Ethan found himself staring at her, unable to tear his gaze away. Her laugh, the way her lips curved when she spoke, the way her hands moved gracefully as she reached for the bread, it all seemed to draw him in deeper. The lines between motherly affection and something more were blurring faster than he could handle. As dinner came to an end, Claire stood to clear the plates. She moved around the kitchen with the same grace she always had, but tonight, there was something different about the way she carried herself. Ethan watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if he could stop himself from saying what he had been thinking for weeks now, what he had been trying so desperately to push away. Claire turned to him, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was a flicker of something between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had been building over the past few months. Claire knew that Ethan had noticed it too. She could see it in his eyes, the way they softened when they looked at her. She took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan, we can't ignore this anymore. Can we?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the battle between what he knew was right and the emotions that were overwhelming him. For a moment, he thought about pushing her away, about stepping back from the edge. But instead, he found himself taking a step forward, drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, the boundary between them that had once seemed so clear began to crumble. What had started as an innocent affection had turned into something more dangerous, something they both knew could never be undone. Claire reached out, her hand trembling slightly as it brushed against his. The touch sent a jolt through Ethan, a surge of warmth that ignited something deep within him. He knew, with terrifying clarity, that their lives were about to change forever. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Claire and Ethan grew, an invisible thread binding them ever tighter. What had once been a quiet, unspoken attraction now simmered beneath the surface, ready to erupt at the slightest provocation. Ethan, though deeply troubled by his feelings, couldn't escape the pull of Claire's presence. It was as if every encounter, every touch, drew him deeper into something he couldn't control, something that felt as dangerous as it did inevitable. The air was thick with unspoken words the next time Ethan visited Claire's house. The usual friendly greetings and small talk seemed forced, like a mask they both wore to disguise the truth that lingered just beneath. William was away again, leaving the house eerily quiet, as it had been the night their connection had shifted. Claire had invited Ethan to dinner once more, but this time, there was no hiding what had transpired between them. As the evening unfolded, Claire and Ethan shared the meal in an almost ritualistic silence. Claire set the table with care, but her hands trembled slightly as she placed each dish in front of him. She could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her, yet it was accompanied by a strange sense of liberation. The more she looked at Ethan, the more she felt herself falling deeper into the pull of their forbidden bond. He was no longer the boy she had raised, he was a man now, and the way he looked at her made her feel desired in a way she hadn't in years. Ethan, on the other hand, felt his heart pounding in his chest with every glance he stole at Claire. His mind screamed at him to stop, to pull away, but his body betrayed him, urging him to stay closer, to allow the distance between them to shrink. There was a magnetic force between them now, one that neither could resist. After dinner, they moved to the living room, a familiar place where they had spent hours in the past, talking about church, about life. But tonight, the room felt different, charged, as if the walls themselves could sense the shift in their relationship. Claire sat down first, her back against the couch, and Ethan followed, hesitating for a moment before joining her. Their eyes met, and this time, there was no hiding the intensity. No more pretending. Without thinking, Claire reached for his hand. The contact was electric. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and he could feel his pulse racing. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times in his mind, but now that it was happening, it felt surreal. He wanted to pull away, to run, but something in Claire's touch held him in place. Her fingers intertwined with his, and the world outside seemed to disappear. There was only the two of them, caught in a web of desire and guilt. "Ethan," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible, "I need you to understand, this isn't just something we can walk away from. This is real." Ethan's heart slammed against his chest. His mind screamed in protest, but his lips betrayed him, whispering the words he had been too afraid to say. "I know." They sat there in silence, the weight of their unspoken feelings settling between them like an unshakable force. Ethan couldn't bring himself to move, couldn't bring himself to break the moment. He was in too deep now, too far gone to retreat. The pull of Claire's gaze, the softness of her hand in his, the way she leaned toward him with a tenderness he had never known before, all made it impossible to resist. Claire leaned in, her lips just inches from his. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he felt the heat of her proximity. He could smell the faint scent of her perfume, a fragrance that had become as familiar to him as the smell of his own mother's embrace. It felt like the world had slowed, as if time had frozen, and there was only this moment. This dangerous, thrilling moment that neither of them could escape. Without a word, Claire closed the gap between them, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as if both of them were unsure whether to take that final step. But the hesitation didn't last long. The kiss deepened, and all the emotions they had been holding back, years of loneliness, desire, guilt, poured out in that one touch. It was a kiss that was both a relief and a curse, a moment of passion that felt right and wrong all at once. When they finally pulled away, both were breathless, eyes wide with the realization of what they had just done. Ethan's hands trembled as he pulled back slightly, his mind reeling. He could feel the weight of what had just transpired, the enormity of their betrayal crashing down on him. But the shame didn't last long. The desire was still there, burning bright in his chest. Claire, too, felt the same mix of guilt and exhilaration. She looked at Ethan, her heart racing, and she knew there was no going back now. The line they had crossed was one they could never uncross. Their relationship, once pure, innocent, and maternal, had morphed into something dark and forbidden, something that could destroy them both. But in that moment, Claire didn't care. She needed this. She had waited too long for something to feel alive again. They both knew the consequences of their actions, but neither could stop what had already begun. The days that followed their first kiss were a blur of stolen moments and hurried encounters. Each time Ethan and Claire saw each other, the weight of their secret pressed heavier on their shoulders, but the thrill of their connection kept them locked in a dangerous cycle. Claire's home became their sanctuary, a place where they could momentarily escape the guilt that gnawed at their hearts, a place where they could feel alive again, free from the confines of their lives. But as the days went on, the cracks in their carefully constructed world began to show. The guilt grew, suffocating Ethan, drowning him in shame. Each time he returned to his father's house, the walls seemed to close in around him. The weight of the lie became too much to bear. His conscience screamed at him, warning him that he was betraying not only his father, but also the moral compass that had guided him through his life. His faith, his relationship with Claire, everything was falling apart. Claire, too, felt the strain of their secret. She had lived for years in a marriage devoid of affection, but what she and Ethan had now was something more, a passion that had reignited something deep within her. But the more she allowed herself to indulge in this forbidden affair, the more the fear began to creep in. What if their secret came to light? What if Pastor William found out? What if the community discovered the truth? It was during one of those long, quiet evenings, when the tension between them had reached its peak, that the unthinkable happened. Ethan had been sitting alone at the kitchen table, his head buried in his hands, when Claire entered the room. She had been gone for hours, running errands in town, and the house had felt eerily empty without her. As she walked in, her gaze met his, and for a moment, they just stood there, silently acknowledging the strain between them. "You can't keep this from him forever, Claire," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "We can't keep living like this." Claire's face faltered. She knew he was right. But the fear of the consequences was too much to confront. She had lived in a cage for years, and now that she had tasted freedom, she wasn't ready to give it up, not yet. She was afraid of what might happen if they confessed everything. The truth would destroy everything they had built. But before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, loud, hurried. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The door to the kitchen flew open, and standing in the doorway was Pastor William Matthews, her husband. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and betrayal. Claire froze, the color draining from her face. Ethan stood up quickly, his heart pounding. The reality of the moment settled over them like a thick fog. "How long, Claire?" William's voice was low, almost guttural. "How long has this been going on?" Ethan's mind raced as he tried to process the situation. The room seemed to tilt, and his vision blurred. This was it. The truth was finally out, and there was no escaping the fallout. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't speak. What could she say? What could she do? Everything she had feared had come to pass. Pastor William's voice grew louder, more accusatory. Was it that easy, Claire? Did you just throw everything away for a moment of weakness? For him? Claire felt the walls closing in. She wanted to explain, to tell him it wasn't about weakness. It was about a need that had been ignored for so long, a hunger she had buried under the guise of faith and duty. But she couldn't find the words. She couldn't explain how something that had started as a gesture of care had transformed into something much darker. Ethan stepped forward, his face pale, his hands shaking. It wasn't what you think, William. We didn't mean for this to happen. But before he could finish, Claire's husband raised a hand, silencing him. You're nothing more than a liar, a betrayer, just like her. You think I don't know what's been going on? The whispers in the church? The rumors that have been following you both? You think I didn't notice? A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine. He realized in that moment that Pastor William hadn't just stumbled upon the truth by accident. He had known for weeks. The shock and disbelief in Ethan's mind slowly gave way to a darker realization. William wasn't just angry, he was plotting something far more sinister than either of them could anticipate. The tension between them had been building, but now it was clear, Pastor William had been waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to act. Claire, William said, his voice dropping to a whisper, you've made a grave mistake. And so have you, Ethan. As his words hung in the air, the reality of the situation became clear. Their affair, their secret, was no longer just a matter of broken trust or infidelity. It was a matter of survival. The stakes were much higher than either Claire or Ethan had realized. This was no longer about passion, it was about the consequences of their actions, the destruction they had unleashed. Ethan's heart raced. Claire's face was pale with fear. They both understood, in that moment, that their lives would never be the same again. Before either of them could react, Pastor William turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The door slammed shut behind him. The room seemed to shrink, the weight of the consequences pressing down on them. Ethan and Claire stood in the kitchen, staring at the door, each lost in the crushing realization that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The twist had come, the truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the kitchen was suffocating, thick with the weight of everything that had just transpired. Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend the reality of the situation. Pastor William had known. He had known all along. The crushing realization hit him like a wave, sweeping away whatever sense of control he had left. His body trembled, his chest tight with anxiety, but more than anything, a deep sense of guilt consumed him. It wasn't just his betrayal of William, it was his betrayal of the man who had raised him like a father, the very man who had trusted him, who had been there for him in ways his own father could never be. Claire, too, was paralyzed by the fallout. The shock of the confrontation was still fresh, but beyond that, there was a deep fear that gnawed at her insides. What would happen now? What would William do? What would the town say? Claire's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling into chaos as the weight of their secret exposure loomed over her like a dark cloud. Her entire world, her family, her reputation, everything she had worked so hard to preserve, was hanging by a fragile thread. The next few days were a blur of confusion and dread. Ethan didn't return to the house. He couldn't bring himself to face Claire or the man who had once been like a father to him. He stayed holed up in his room, the suffocating guilt and shame closing in around him. He had never imagined that something as simple as a kiss, a fleeting moment of weakness, would lead to this. His thoughts swirled with images of Claire, her kindness, her warmth, and the undeniable passion that had developed between them. It had started innocently enough, but now, it had shattered everything. As for Claire, she had no idea how to face the man she had been married to for decades. The man who had once been her partner, her protector, now seemed like a stranger. William's cold silence after the confrontation was deafening. She couldn't recall the last time he had looked at her with anything other than disdain. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. In the days that followed, Claire received no comfort, no apology. William didn't speak to her, didn't acknowledge her presence. Their marriage, once built on shared faith and commitment, was now nothing more than a hollow shell of what it had been. The church, too, was affected. The whispers began almost immediately. Rumors spread like wildfire, and soon, Claire found herself the subject of hushed conversations and accusatory glares. The community she had once been a beloved part of had turned its back on her. The very people she had helped, the families she had nurtured, now avoided her. They couldn't reconcile the image of the woman who had once been their pillar of faith with the woman who had betrayed her husband, the very man they had all trusted. The weight of their judgment was unbearable. Ethan could feel the shift in the town as well. People whispered when he passed, avoiding his gaze, offering only cold glances. The shame that had been building in him erupted in full force now. He had betrayed not just his father figure but the entire community that had supported him. His actions had torn apart everything he had ever known. What had started as a fleeting moment of weakness had led to a complete unraveling of his life. No amount of regret could undo the damage that had been done. But as the days turned into weeks, Claire found herself facing something more than just the isolation and rejection. She was forced to confront the truth about herself, about the choices she had made. She had lived in a cage for years, shackled by the expectations of others, and in her desperation to feel alive again, she had hurt everyone around her. She had betrayed her husband, her faith, and the community that had always supported her. The affair with Ethan, though initially an escape, had only brought more destruction than she could have ever imagined. Ethan, too, began to understand the gravity of his actions. The pain in his heart, the guilt that weighed him down, was a constant reminder of the irreversible damage he had caused. He had loved Claire, in his own way, but the reality of their relationship was far from romantic. It was a dangerous web they had woven, a desperate attempt to fill the voids in their lives. Ethan had been searching for love and attention that he had never received from his own family, while Claire had been yearning for the affection and passion that had long since been lost in her marriage. But now, with everything destroyed, Ethan realized that their actions had been driven not by love, but by need and desperation. As the months went by, the community slowly moved on, but for Claire and Ethan, there was no moving forward. Claire's marriage was beyond repair. William left, abandoning both his wife and the church, unable to face the shame. Claire, now alone, had no choice but to leave the town she had called home for so long. She couldn't face the people she had once cared for, couldn't bear the whispers that followed her everywhere. She left Kentucky, seeking refuge in a new place, where no one knew her, where she could rebuild the shattered pieces of her life. Ethan, too, found it impossible to stay. The weight of his actions was unbearable, and though his father never spoke the words aloud, Ethan knew that his trust had been broken beyond repair. He left for a new life, away from the memories, away from the pain. The affair had begun as an escape, a brief moment of passion that had offered them both something they had longed for. But in the end, it had only led to devastation. Claire and Ethan both learned the hard way that nothing lasts forever, and some actions can never be undone. The lesson they both learned, too late, was that running away from pain only leads to more destruction, and that sometimes, the consequences of our choices are more than we can bear. Time passed, but for Claire and Ethan, their lives were forever changed. The town of Bellwood, Kentucky had moved on, as towns do, but for the two of them, the scars of their actions ran deep. Claire, once the beloved wife of the town's pastor, had become a pariah. Ethan, the young man who had once been seen as the future of his community, was now a man haunted by his mistakes. The love they had shared, however twisted and fleeting, had been their undoing, and now, they had to live with the consequences. Claire's marriage was irreparably broken. William Matthews, though he never spoke openly about the affair, had left Bellwood, his face forever etched with betrayal and heartbreak. The man who had once been her partner, her confidant, now seemed like a stranger. Claire never saw him again, and with his departure, a part of her own soul seemed to go with him. But despite the pain, Claire felt a certain relief. Her guilt was now something that could be buried away from the eyes of the community, hidden in the distance. She moved far from Kentucky, to a small town where no one knew her name. The life she had once known was gone. The friendships she had nurtured over the years had dissolved, and the identity she had built in Bellwood was lost. In her new life, Claire found solace in small, simple things. She became a shadow of who she had once been, but a more subdued, careful version of herself. She worked in a modest cafe, interacting with customers whose lives were untouched by the chaos she had caused. But even in the anonymity of her new surroundings, Claire couldn't shake the gnawing regret. She had traded everything for a moment of passion, and now, she was left with nothing but the weight of her decisions. Ethan, too, had left Bellwood. His father had never outright condemned him, but Ethan could see the devastation in his eyes. The trust that had once existed between them was now gone, replaced by a quiet disappointment that hung heavy in the air whenever they shared a space. Ethan couldn't bear to stay, and he moved to a city far from the place that had once been his home. There, he tried to rebuild, but the guilt followed him. He had destroyed more than just his relationship with Claire, he had destroyed his own sense of self. No amount of distance could erase the weight of what he had done. Both Claire and Ethan were left with broken pieces of their lives. Their affair, which had started as an act of rebellion against loneliness and desperation, had ended in ruin. They both understood, too late, that love built on need and escape could never stand the test of time. It was a love that consumed them, hollowed them out, and left them as empty shells, searching for redemption that could never come. As the years went on, both Claire and Ethan tried to forget, to move forward. But the ghosts of their pasts haunted them in quiet moments, the empty spaces in their lives where once, they had found solace in each other's arms. In the end, the lesson was clear: no matter how much you may seek to run from your past, it will always find you. And when you build your life on a foundation of lies and deceit, the cracks will eventually show. The consequences, once hidden beneath the surface, will always rise to the top. The affair had been a momentary escape from the pain of their lives, but it had come at an unbearable cost. Claire lost her marriage, her reputation, and her place in the community. Ethan lost the trust of his father and the respect of his town. Their actions had rippled out in ways neither of them could have predicted, destroying everything they had once known. They had each lost so much, and yet, perhaps the greatest loss of all was the innocence they had once shared. For Claire, it was the loss of her own sense of self-worth, the realization that she had traded her dignity for fleeting passion. For Ethan, it was the loss of his future, the promise of a life built on love and respect, now destroyed by a moment of weakness. But, what about you? How would you have handled a situation like this? Do you believe Claire and Ethan's affair was just a result of their unfulfilled desires, or was it something deeper? Could they have saved their relationships and their lives before it all fell apart? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and let us know what you think about this tragic story. Do you think there's a way for someone to redeem themselves after making such a huge mistake? What lessons do you think can be learned from Claire and Ethan's journey? Share your opinions with us. And if you found this story moving, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that delve into the darkest corners of human nature. Join us next time as we explore more tales of betrayal, regret, and the consequences of our actions.